Mobeen Sayed from Drbeen.com. Welcome to one more show. So, the baby formula issue, the food for infants formula, the powder, US is going through a crisis at this time, and we do not have sufficient food, and parents, mothers are going from store to try to figure out if they can find the formula. So you must have read a lot of stories about how this happened. Why did we end up here? I want to discuss that, but even more importantly, I want to discuss the pathogen, the bacteria or bacterium that was at the root of the problem that triggered this all. That bacteria's name is Cronobacter Sakazakii. And I want to discuss the situation today, the factors that are causing this, and then the pathogenesis of that bacteria's, the way it attacks us, and then talk about why this is serious. So let's start. So the current situation is that 40% of the baby formula in the USA is out of stock. Let me just have my mouse here. So this is our medical disclaimer. I have no disclosures. These are references at the end of the video. These references are present. Plus, in the description of this video, the references are also present. So the current situation. The situation is this, that Abbott last year was contributing or producing 40% or more of the total baby formula used in the USA. And Abbott's plant in Michigan was voluntarily shut down in February because of 4 infections reported. Out of these 4, unfortunately, 2 infants have actually died. Although now Abbott has done their investigations, the FDA has done their investigation, and the fingerprint of the bacteria found in the Abbott plant versus the bacteria found in the children is not the same. But that has started this domino effect, where here we are with the lack of the baby formula. So this is a report here. US allows more baby formula imports to fight shortage. They are also allowing Abbott to open up their Michigan plant. The problem is that even after this, when Abbott would resume baby formula production in that plant, the product would end up on the shelves after 6 to 8 weeks of their resuming the production. So if they start producing, let's say, a month after or 2 weeks after, then the countdown will be after that time. And if these imports that are allowed, if these actually start happening, then that can take many months as well. For me, I think the only hope will be to be able to import them from our neighboring countries. And this is the message I gave earlier. Abbott is saying that these samples of bacteria are not the same. Now, why did this all happen? In February, there were reports of 4 children, infants, who became infected with Cronobacter Sakazakii, and we'll discuss in detail how that works, how that bacteria cause damage. Actually, the name even, Cronobacter, that pathogen is named that way because the Greek god who has this name is known to eat babies, its own babies, when they are produced. And because this pathogen attacks infants and immunocompromised adults, that is why the name was given. So Abbott started their investigation, FDA started their investigation. Unfortunately, sadly, two children have died. Now, this is FDA, sorry, CDC site. So CDC site is saying powdered formula is not sterile and might have germs in it. And in addition to that, Cronobacter Sakazakii can be found in the homes as well. Powdered formula can get Cronobacter in it after you open the container. This pathogen, and I'll go in detail a little later, this is present in almost majority of the people and healthy people. This is an opportunistic bacteria that lives in our gut. That means it normally does not cause infection or does not cause disease. Infection is presence of the bacteria, so we can say it is present, but it does not cause disease unless our immune system becomes weak enough for it to take the opportunity to infect us or to cause disease. Cronobacter can live on surfaces in your home, such as a kitchen counter or sinks, water, could get into the powder formula if formula lids or scoops are placed on contaminated surfaces and later touch the formula. It can also get into formula if the formula is mixed with contaminated water or in contaminated bottle. Now, in the factories, how can the Cronobacter end up in the formula? If the manufacturer uses contaminated raw materials or if the formula powder touches a contaminated surface. For example, in the case of Michigan plant, FDA said that there were plant workers who were not wearing gloves or were not complying with the procedures for hygiene. And because this pathogen is present in the intestine, it can actually end up on people's hands. And then if they do not wash their hands or if they do not wear the gloves, those hands, if they are dirty, can then contaminate other surfaces. And from those surfaces, the pathogen can end up in the food products as well. Now, you might think that if the pathogen is present on a surface, then it would just die. This pathogen can actually live in the powder. Dry powder is a very dry environment, right? It can live there for 2.5 years. So it is quite hardy and it can live under dry conditions and osmotic stresses. Now, fine, we understand that there is a pathogen that caused damage and it was correct to shut down the factory and to make sure that there is no further damage. Plus, there is a recall as well. But here is another interesting thing. 95% of the baby formula is manufactured in the US. That is not a problem, though. It's actually a good thing. We in the US are manufacturing something, almost all of it. Our own industry is flourishing with that. So that is a good thing. However, here is the bad thing. Only 4 major players are producing this formula. So we sit here sometimes and talk about big pharma and their dominance. Here you see another group of companies that are dominating the formula production. And you would see this that in our country, in the US, we have developed this behavior that bigger companies, as they continue to grow, they continue to take over and start dominating, although there are laws that are antitrust laws, although there are rules and regulations and procedures to make sure that smaller players do not get stifled. Even then, only 4 companies produce majority of the baby formula. Mead Johnson, Abbott, Nestle, and Perrigo. Now, please remember this, Abbott, whose plant was shut down. Last year, 42% of the formula was produced by Abbott. So you stop Abbott's production, you take half, almost half, or near that of the formula away. So that was a single point of failure. It was going to happen at some point. And the question is, What other areas have this single point of failure? We have already seen healthcare areas where there are single point of failures. Here you're seeing another, such a critical area, infants. So I'm not sitting here advocating that we should allow foreign companies to work. We should allow whatever is right for us. But this does not look right to me. That only four companies, and they have the major market cap for producing the formula. One of them 42%. That one stops, and we have a crisis in the country. Now, foreign imports, there are tariffs on them, which again, I am pro manufacturing, producing within our own country. So I don't have a problem if there are tariffs that encourage local production. But at the same time, I have a problem for what is going on inside here. So then the FDA has requirements for labeling and ingredients. So it is a little difficult from outside formula. And I actually, again, these are babies, these are infants we're talking about. So I'm actually comfortable with this, that infant related things are produced here under strict rules and regulations so that there is less harm to infants. Now, 57 to 68% of the baby formula is purchased by our special supplemental nutritional program for women, infants, and children for those who cannot afford it. Because this WIC department buys about 57 to 68%, they are the ones who also decide which manufacturer will get their contract. And the manufacturers win their contract by giving them heavy discount. And once that discount is given, then when this support is given to a family, they can only buy the formula from that particular seller or brand. So that is another interesting way that one of them dominates every year. Now, with this, let's talk about the bacteria itself that kind of started this whole thing, Cronobacter Sakazakii. And we'll have that discussion with my drawings. So here, so imagine this is just a new part of the lecture. So Cronobacter Sakazakii is a gram-negative bacteria or pathogen. It is facultatively anaerobic. That means when oxygen is present, it can use oxygen to make its energy. But if oxygen is not present, it can do fermentation and continue to work. It has these two proteins on its surface, which are called OMP-A and OMP-X, outer membrane protein A and X. These two proteins are its virulence factors, especially the OMP-A. And we'll see how it works in the future. Future meaning a little later in the discussion. In addition to that, this is a motile bacteria. It can move around. It is catalase negative. So those who are from healthcare, they know what catalases are. So it is catalase negative, it is oxidase negative, and it is an opportunistic pathogen. Opportunistic means it lives without bothering us, in us. However, when we become weak, when our immune system becomes weak, then it attacks us. Then it says, all right, I'm going to get busy eating this thing up. So it becomes harmful when we're weak. And when it attacks us, when we are weak, then it causes life-threatening infections. It can cause meningitis. It can cause brain tissue damage. It can cause sepsis and many other diseases. But these are the important ones. So it's not that there is a infection for a day and then it's gone. It can cause life-threatening infections. lives in the intestine of healthy individuals. Now, this is a baby formula. This is a container. This pathogen was, it'll be interesting for you. It was actually found in a milk container, in a dry milk container, I think in 1955 or so. But that doesn't mean that it came into being in these containers. It must have been out there for millions of years, but it can live in these hardy, dry places. It is resistant to osmotic stress. Osmotic stress simply means that if the place is dry and then there are heavy, bigger molecules that are pulling water, it they can pull water out of this pathogen as well and kind of dry it up. It can live with that. It can handle it. And similarly, if it the dryness around this, the powder is dry, it can handle that as well. So in one of the studies by a all study in 2019, they showed that this pathogen in the dry environment, especially in the powdered infant formula, it could live there in storage for 2.5 years and still be viable. And another important thing is it is actually present on many environmental forms, especially it is found on food and herbs as well. So herbal teas sometimes can have this. So why is that important? A normal healthy adult is usually not infected or doesn't get illness from this, even if they ingest this pathogen. However, if someone consumed herbal tea and they touched the tea or the tea spilled on them, or while making there was some tea that is on their hands, now it is possible that they have this pathogen on their hands. From there, the pathogen can then go on the surfaces, it can go to the baby, and so on. Now, this pathogen infects infants 2 years, 2 months and lesser. And so you can say, why 2 months and lesser? Why? What does it have with the age? It actually can be present in any of us. 2 months infant, or 3 months, or a toddler, or a child, or an adult, but it establishes or causes illness when somebody's immune system is weak. Children, infants who are just born, their immune systems are not fully developed yet. So it can cause infection in them. It can also cause infection in premature babies, infants with weak immune system. And in the same way, even in the adults, 65 years plus adults, or adults who are immunocompromised, that may be immunocompromised because of, for example, HIV, or that may be immunocompromised because they're taking immunosuppressing drugs, or they are the patients of, or they had organ transplant and now they're taking drugs for immunosuppression, and so on, cancers. Now, when a baby develops illness with this pathogen, then the very first thing is the fever. Poor feeding. Now, please remember that infants who are 2 months, lesser than 2 months, they do not have a lots of ways to communicate that I am not feeling well. So usually what happens is they become more flaccid, kind of loose. They become lethargic, less responsive. They do not eat that well or drink that well. So they cry a lot. These are the kind of indications, not that a 2 months old infant would wake up and say, well, I have fever. So fever, poor feeding, excessive crying, low energy, kind of flaccid, lethargic, and they may even develop seizures. That will be a sign that meningitis is occurring or brain tissue damage is occurring. Now the question is, how does this pathogen cause damage? So here is what happens. Imagine if the child's food, the formula, has a pathogen in it. That pathogen ends up in their GIT after they have taken that food. In the GIT, in our gastrointestinal tract, in the gut cells, the surface cells, these cells have a specific protein on them called fibronectin. So what happens is, if you see here, let me make this one a little bigger. This is a cell. Inside the cell, there is cytoskeleton. Cytoskeleton is nothing but the bones of the cell, the structures of the cell. These are the ones that keep the cell in its shape and help with lots of other functions. So here is a cytoskeleton. Attached to the cytoskeleton is another protein called integrin, and then attached to the integrin is another protein called fibronectin. These are protruding outwards from the cell. The function of these proteins is to adhere to other cells or help adhere to other cells, help bind to other cells. And just like we sometimes see, we have been discussing that COVID, SARS-CoV-2 likes ACE2. This pathogen binds with fibronectin. So imagine the child has taken the food which has this pathogen in it. The pathogen ends up in the GIT, the surface cells, the epithelial cells, it is now brushing against. It's going to very quickly bind to their fibronectin. Imagine fibronectin are like little hair that are coming out. They're not really like hair, but imagine small protein threads coming out of the cell. And this pathogen holds them. It binds with fibronectin. Once it binds with fibronectin, then what it does is, number one, it can just bind there and just hold on to the place and just stay there. That is how in many healthy people it does. Just binds there and sticks there. But in those whose immune system is weak or developing, then what this pathogen does is that, if you see here, it is connected with the fibronectin. Here is the outer membrane protein A and X. Remember I said that we'll talk about OMP A and X. It uses these to enter the cell. Exactly how does it do it is not known. But it does it if these two proteins are present. We call them virulence factors because they allow this pathogen to cause illness or do the mechanisms that will cause the illness. So it binds with the cell with fibronectin, then it uses these outer membrane proteins to enter the cell. Once it enters the cell, it can then develop more, and then it can come out from the other side of the cell. That will be exocytosis. Now, what is on the other side of the cell? One side of the cell is GIT. Other side, the back side of the cell, is blood. So there is interstitial tissue here, that is an empty space, tissue space, and then blood vessels. It comes out of the cell and then enters the blood vessels. When it enters the blood vessel, that is when the problem would start. Although there is problem before as well, but this would become even more dangerous because now it can go to blood-brain barrier. So we'll go there in a second. When it is infecting these cells, it can release toxins which we actually do not know what these toxins are. But we call them enterotoxins because we know that this pathogen can actually kill these epithelial cells or GIT cells. It can cause enterocolitis. So colon and the GIT nearby, it can actually cause infection and death of those cells. So if you see here, I've made a few dead cells. So necrotizing enterocolitis, that is areas of tissue death and inflammation in the GIT and colon. So it's not that it just would have to go into the blood and then go to blood-brain barrier to cause the damage. It can actually start damage right from the GIT itself. Okay, so once it has entered the blood, then it would go to brain. I want to before we go and see what happens to the brain, there is one more mechanism for its cause for illness or entry into our cells. And that is, imagine this is the GIT. This is where all the food has entered. This, this side is the brush border or epithelial cells. Imagine our intestine are like a tube. Whatever is in there, for example, the food that we eat, we don't want that food to just spill into our body. We want to break down that food and we want to churn it and put acids on it and kind of make it into a slime. And then we want to selectively pick the things from it that we want. And the tube has to be airtight. It has to not allow things to enter other than those things, those substances, nutrients, molecules that it selectively picks up and then pumps into the body. So one mechanism to create that seal is that between the cells, there is something called tight junctions. So cells are, imagine if we are all standing in a line and we are kind of so closely crammed into each other that there is no place between us and no one can cross that little wall of people that is made. Similarly, these cells that are here, they adhere to each other through something called tight junction. These tight junctions are like seals around the cells with which they bind with the other cells. And now this becomes an very airtight like product. In the young infants, 1 month, 2 months, even more, the tight junctions are yet not fully developed. That means that GIT cells have not developed tight boundaries. This pathogen uses the intercellular spaces that is between the cell and slip in between the cells all the way to the back of the cell where there is interstitial tissue and then there is blood. So that is the second mechanism. So eventually, it enters the cell and then comes out on the other side, or it slips between the cells and comes out on the other side. Eventually, it can enter the blood vessels. Once it's inside the blood, then from there it goes to the brain. It comes out of the blood-brain barrier. It can cause meningitis, that is the membranes of the brain and the spinal cord, and it can cause them to be inflamed. In addition to that, it can actually infect the neurons and damage them. Because of that, if the child survives, their growth becomes retarded, their brain growth becomes retarded, it becomes slow. And so they have slow development of the brain just because they had this infection. This is such a serious pathogen. It's not just another bacterial infection that child's GIT become disturbed and now they are okay. If it goes to the brain, one, it can cause meningitis. Second, it can cause brain tissue death. Third, the brain tissue development becomes stalled. So I think with these, it kind of makes sense to understand why this is such a serious thing that they stopped everything and they said, stop the plant. So let's very quickly now, for the last part, look at some of the references. So first of all, this is drbeen.com. If you would like to support this work, if you would like to have more lectures of this kind, there are 1,000 lectures here on drbeen.com in our video library. And in the description of this video, there is a link that you can use. The price is affordable, almost free, and you can have access to these 1,000 videos. Here is the US allows more baby formula imports to fight shortage. Then here is the etmo etymologia, or the nomenclature of this bacteria. So if you see here, the genus was named for Kronos, the titan of Greek myth who devoured his children as they were born. And here we are not talking about the bacteria and its own children, but it can hurt our children. Then what caused the baby formula storage? Some of the references are from there. Here is the CDC's article that I showed. All of these links are present um, in the video's description. This is the recall. So CDC did their investigation, 4 illnesses, 2 deaths, 3 states, recall yes, investigation is closed, and they have specific pictures and advice for what kind of formula not to use. This is another article from CDC and FDA on it. And if you see here, they're showing what product images to be aware of. This is a note about this. Wikipedia, if you don't like Wikipedia, you can look at microbiology books about this pathogen. This is a very good article. This article actually is 9 March 2020. We're in 2022. Here they are saying that emergence of Cronobacter Sakazakii in cases of neonatal sepsis in Upper Egypt. First report in North Africa. So this actually outbreak occurred in Egypt as well in 2020. And then this is a very good article about the mechanism of action. So this is the discussion. Again, the summary is we are still in the shortage. There may be formula that will be allowed to come in from foreign countries. Even then, it can take months for it to start arriving. Abbott's factory, I believe, have been conditionally allowed to be reopened. They're given a set of procedures to comply with. However, they say that once they resume the activity, and they had closed it voluntarily, once they resume the production, it would take 6 to 8 weeks. And that is when they resume. So as soon as they become ready to do it. Our bigger issue is that 4 companies make almost all of the formula. Abbott makes 42%. Last year, they made 42%. So there is a monopoly between these 4 companies. And Abbott was acting as a single, to me, it seems like it is a single point of failure. And that is what just happened. So with this, thank you very much. Please like, subscribe, and share. And there are some links in the description if you would like to purchase a plan to drbeen.com with about 1,000 videos. The price is under $100. So you'll like that. And if you would just like to support this work, there are links in the description. You can buy me a coffee, or you can use PayPal, or you can become a patron, or you can become a Substack. There are lots of options. Thank you very much. And I would see you on Cool Beans Cafe Live, the other channel where we'll just do chit chats. So see you there in a few minutes.